data. Through machine learning, she is transforming the data we all carry inside us and transforming how we'll all care for ourselves in the very near future. That's why Daniela Witten joins our exclusive list of the innovators. I'm Hanson Hossein. Welcome to Forbes. Well, Daniela Witten, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you've gotten all this really amazing public recognition at such a young age and a young point in your career. What's so revolutionary about the work that you do?
Well, those recognitions are certainly an honor, but I feel like I'm really lucky to be working in an area that's really taking off right now. So my research involves developing machine learning methods to analyze big data, and big data refers to the massive amounts of information that are now being generated in lots of different areas of science and industry. So for instance, a cancer researcher is now able to sequence an individual's tumor genome in order to understand what are the DNA mutations that are responsible.
So that's a lot of data coming from our body then, right? Like from that genome, how much data are we talking about?
So that's a lot of data. You know, your genome is 3 billion base pairs, so 3 billion letters, A, T, G, or C. That's sure a lot of information. And this type of big data isn't just limited to biology. There's also this type of data coming in every day at Amazon and at Google and at lots of different companies worldwide, but also a lot of them here in Seattle. And so the question is really, how can we develop techniques to make sense of these massive amounts of data and to transform it into really useful information?
Because I've heard a lot about big data. That's the real sort of development that everybody's talking about. All businesses want to be in big data. Because of all these devices we've got all this stuff being generated, but there's no real way to make sense of it right now.
Right. Yeah. So the idea is that 10 years ago, we didn't have nearly as much data as we had today, but now today, across all different areas, we have these massive amounts of data. And people used to think if only we could collect the data, then we'd be able to answer really important questions. But it turns out that there's a missing link, and that missing link is the statistical techniques that are needed in order to convert that data into information. And so like one example is you know, if you're Amazon and you're trying to, based on where a person clicks on the website and what that person buys, you want to make a recommendation for what other items they might want to purchase. There's a massive amount of data that Amazon collects every day, but streamlining that into a successful algorithm that can really effectively predict what that person is going to want to buy is not so straightforward.
So why didn't you go work for Amazon or Facebook or Google? Why health? Why or biology?
Well, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions in biology right now. So I'm not an experimental biologist, but experimental biologists have developed these incredible techniques in the last 10 years that make it possible to go into a tissue or even to an individual cell and understand what's really happening on a molecular level. They can obtain billions of measurements for what molecules are present in a tissue or in a cell. And people used to think it would be really easy once we got this data to really understand sort of fundamental biological insights. But it turns out, again, it's not so easy because the statistical methods needed to understand this data just aren't there yet. And I want to help solve that problem because there's so much potential to really answer fundamental questions.
So I'm just showing a little bit of graphic that you used at your TEDxUW talk last year. You know, what's different now? If we are actually able to use this data properly, how does that change how we, say, care for a woman with breast cancer?
Yeah, well, so the idea is that you know, people used to think that there was just one disease called breast cancer. And then people realized actually there's a few types of breast cancer, where on a molecular level, there can be different cancers, different breast cancers that look the same to a clinician, but if you sort of look at things on a molecular level, there's heterogeneity in breast cancer.
And so that means that it's different for everybody.
Right. Well, so initially people thought maybe 5 years ago that maybe there's like 4 types of breast cancer. And so if a lady comes into the clinic with breast cancer, we just need to figure out what type of breast cancer she has, and then we can give her the ideal treatment based on that type. And so people spent a lot of energy trying to characterize these different types of breast cancer and figure out how to treat each one. But now it actually turns out that the picture is even more complicated, and maybe there's not 4 types of breast cancer. Maybe every individual who has breast cancer really has their own unique disease, and we need to try to unravel what's going on in each individual's cancer so that we can give them the best possible treatment.
On the face of it, that sounds like a nightmare that there's that many different types of breast cancer.
Right. Well, yeah, it's very complicated, and this is really often what you get into when you're faced with this type of big data, where you have more and more information, because you can now measure all of these different molecules and all these different things that are happening within a particular breast cancer sample. But just having that data doesn't help you unless you have a way to kind of sift through all of the numbers, all of the data, in order to find sort of the useful information in there.
So what solution have you developed that actually makes sense of that data?
Well, a lot of what I do, I don't want to get too technical, but a lot of what I do really does involve trying to come up with algorithms to try to systematically sift through the data and find the underlying signal. And part of why this is really challenging is because, when I have a huge amount of data, but there's only 100 cancer patients in my data set. So I have a huge number of measurements for each cancer patient, but only 100 patients. Unless I'm really careful, it's really easy to get results that look good and that make me think that I've really found something in the data that'll work for a new patient walking into the clinic, and that might not really be the case. And so this is really something where, we have to be careful when we analyze these type of data. We need to sort of be enthusiastic and be hopeful, but we also need to temper our enthusiasm and make sure that what we found is really there and is really going to be useful.
It sounds, as I hear you speak, it sounds a little daunting to me as a potential patient one day that all this information is already ingrained in my body, and that somebody can read that, this whole notion of 23andMe, where you can actually give that sample and people can figure out, well, what diseases am I prone to get in the next few years?
Well, that's another really interesting question, because people used to think before the human genome was sequenced, people thought that if we could sequence your individual genome, then we would know everything about you. But it turns out that's not really true, because there's a lot of elements of disease susceptibility and that type of thing that doesn't seem to be hard-coded in DNA, or at least not in a way that people have been able to figure out. And so there's always more mysteries, I guess.
Well, you say you're just a statistician, but you sound like a biologist to me. It's amazing how you have to know all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, looks can be deceiving. I'm really a statistician, so.
Well, when we get back from the break, I'd actually love to speak to you more about your motivation and what actually brought you into this field of study and why you're making such an impact. So we'll be right back with Daniela Witten. We're back with University of Washington's Daniela Witten. Daniela, I mentioned this in the introduction, but you actually contemplated studying foreign languages before you did stats. What motivated you to go into this direction?
Well, I mean, I considered majoring in foreign languages sort of briefly as a high school student and in the beginning of college. But, I'm a very sort of analytical person, and I realized that I needed to become a scientist, but I wasn't sure what type of science to pursue. And part of the problem was that I was really interested in a lot of things, and some people just have one passion and they know that they need to do that from day one. And I was actually the opposite. I was interested in a lot, and the idea of having to choose one particular thing to do for the rest of my career, it really just didn't seem feasible. And that's actually why I ended up becoming a statistician, because the fun thing about being a statistician is that you can work on problems that interest you, and sort of the universal language of statistics, and you can apply that to problems in biology or to problems in finance or to problems in e-commerce. And there's a lot of opportunities to think about a lot of different problems if you have training in statistics.
Well, forgive the pun. It must have been somewhat in your genes, because both of your parents are scientists as well. How much pressure or sort of even did you feel pressure on your own that you felt like you had to go in the same direction as your family?
I don't think that it was external pressure that caused me to become a statistician. But I will say that the fact that I'm sort of an analytical thinker and very quantitative, that might be because of my parents.
And you mentioned that there's great wider application to what you've learned and your expertise, well beyond biology. You could potentially go work for an Amazon or Google one day and you could apply some of the machine learning theories that you're developing right now in biology to another world.
Yeah, and actually, the techniques that those companies are using are not that dissimilar from the ones that people are using to unravel biological questions. And so, it's true. Right now I love what I do, but there's always different applications out there, and I certainly down the road could be interested in another application for my work.
How much is timing involved in terms of, obviously you've been very successful in the research you've done so far, but you're probably still at the beginning of your career, but yet you're being recognized in more mainstream sort of publications. Is it because we are now so fixated on some of these questions because big data has become so big?
Well, I think that I am lucky, to be working in an area that is really a topic of excitement. You know, this is the International Year of Big Data or something like that. And last year there was this big data initiative out of the White House. And this is just something that, that a lot of people care about now, because we really are sort of facing this problem where there's too much data and not enough tools to analyze the data. And also, I should mention, not enough people who are quantitatively trained with the skill set that is actually needed. I mean, if you look at the number of people like in American universities who are majoring in math, majoring in computer science, majoring in statistics, and you compare that to the projection for what's going to be needed in 5 or 10 years, it's an incredibly shocking shortfall. And so, you know, this is a great area to be in now.
Yeah, no, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I'm thinking, how do we make sure, first of all, she's not veered away from the sciences? But it seems to me, even with my own students, that statistics is actually almost a fundamental skill these days.
Yeah, statistics really is a fundamental skill. And just as one example, you know, I collaborate with biologists at University of Washington, and these people are trained as biologists, and they're wonderful, wonderful biologists. But they are also becoming incredible, many of them are already incredible statisticians and incredible data analysts, because they're seeing in their own labs and in their own research an amount of data that, you know, they just need to be able to handle. And so there's a lot of people more and more who you see who are, if they're successful in their field of endeavor, even if they were not trained as a data scientist or as a statistician, they're becoming one sort of on the fly, because those are tools you really need today.
I mean, what I do is storytelling, and in so many articles I've read about big data is that really to understand big data, we need to understand the story that it's trying to tell us. Do you believe that despite the fact that you're a statistician, that you're actually also telling a story behind the data?
Well, that's an interesting question. So one of the things you worry about as a statistician is called overfitting, where you worry that sort of you're trying too hard to tell a story and you come up with a story that's not there. So I try to only tell stories if I'm sure that they're true.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen you actually say that before. And you actually, I wonder how research itself is changing. You actually wrote this article called "The Good, the Bad, the Sloppy," that we may be getting too carried away in terms of this traditional approach to academic peer review, when there's big data is actually dictating that we need to have a different kind of rigor.
Yeah. Well, so I think that we are sort of reaching this problem in a lot of areas of biology, where like traditional peer review. So if I write a paper as a researcher, I send it to a journal, and 2 or 3 peer reviewers who are sort of my colleagues, but they're anonymous to me, and these can be colleagues anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, evaluate my paper and decide if it should be published. And the problem is that in a lot of areas of science, and biology is one example, it's really hard to find 2 or 3 people with the expertise to evaluate my entire paper, because maybe this paper, you know, some biologist with some particular skill set did the experiments, and some clinician with some particular skill sets got the samples from patients that were used in order to do those experiments on, and then I, as a statistician, analyzed the data. And there isn't really, maybe a computer scientist was involved in processing the data. It's really hard to find experts who can actually evaluate the entire paper, because such a very broad set of skills is often required in order to write a paper like that. Similarly, a very broad set of skills is needed in order to assess the quality of the paper.
I'm going to come back to you on that thought when we get back from our break. We'll be right back with Daniela Witten. We're back with Daniela Witten from the University of Washington. Daniela, we're just talking about the need for more rigor, for more collaborators who can keep up with the kind of work that you need to do. You spent a lot of time at Stanford, and then you came to Seattle and the University of Washington, which might seem a bit of an unusual move. Why didn't you stay at Stanford or go back east where your family is?
Well, first of all, University of Washington is a great place to be. I'm in the biostat department, and we're ranked #1. We're tied with a school on the East Coast that you might have heard of, but I don't want to mention them.
Little one somewhere in Boston.
Little one, yeah, it starts with an H, but whatever, And then the stat department here is also fantastic. They're very highly ranked, and so this is a great place to be for the type of work that I do. When you live on the West Coast for 10 years, you really don't want to leave it, and so University of Washington was a great choice.
I think there's a bit of a second status sort of complex Seattle has, especially in relation to the Bay Area. And you came here, you actually brought your husband with you, and he opened the Facebook office when he was still with Facebook. And it's sort of like, oh, we're a satellite of the Bay Area. So when somebody with your focus comes to the University of Washington, you're thinking, wow, that's good. That maybe we're in the big time now.
Yeah, well, we definitely are in my field. I mean, I mentioned our stat and biostat departments at University of Washington are great. The computer science department here is just an incredible department. There's great genome sciences. And so sort of all of the relevant fields that sort of I need to have like a successful research ecosystem are really wonderful at University of Washington. But Seattle is a great place to live too, and that definitely factored into the decision.
Well, that's good to hear. So when you say that you've got the expertise you need for the work that you do in those various departments, what's the culture of collaboration like for the kind of work that you actually need to accomplish?
So there's a wonderful culture of collaboration here at University of Washington, and I think that honestly part of it is the fact that we're a public university and maybe we don't have the resources to throw around, and so everyone's kind of working with limited resources, and so we've got to make the most of our expertise and sort of pool it by collaborating with other people. And so this is really, it's just such a wonderful place to be faculty.
And from a funding point of view, given the challenges this particular universities face and higher education generally, how are you able to find the resources you need to get things done?
Yeah, I mean, I have funding from external sources, and some of my funding comes from the state. And, we're all scraping to get by, but hopefully we can still do good work.
If you have to think about the one or two really big questions you're working on right now that the average person would say, wow, that's really going to affect me as she continues with her work, what are they, you think?
Well, I think it really just boils down to, again, trying to come up with ways to make sense of this really complex data, because, we live in a world where if you're interested in understanding a problem, whether it's like, what is the most effective treatment for a disease, or what is the best way to combat poverty, or whatever it is, you can get that data, and that data is being collected all over the world in massive quantities. But in order to turn that into something useful that we can use in order to really affect change in the world, we're going to need to come up with statistical tools, and so it's really a great time to be a statistician.
So here's what I'm trying to understand about what you need to know. You've got all this data that's coming, and the biologists understand how to get that stuff. You got the healthcare practitioners on the other side who understand what to do about it. You're in the middle, sort of deciphering and translating. How much do you need to know about those respective worlds to do what you're doing? Because if you got to create this algorithm, you need to know what the stuff is, right, and then what it's got to be.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really fun about being a statistician, again, is that you get to work on problems that interest you, and part of that is that you get to learn about completely different areas. And so, like, it's funny because my knowledge of biology is kind of like a lot of detail about like seemingly unrelated areas, because those are the things that I've worked on. But it's great, and you always get to keep learning, and it's always sort of extra enticing to find new collaborators in different areas, because it means I get to find out about something that I didn't know about before.
And how do you stay on top of this? Because it feels like such a fast-moving world right now.
Yeah. You try your best. Hopefully you have smart PhD students who fill you in on what you might have missed.
Yeah, and I guess when you choose your collaborators, especially your PhD students, you want them to be able to feed your research. Are they able to keep up with someone with your level of energy?
Oh, I mean, the graduate students in my department are wonderful, and it's just really been a lot of fun. It's actually pretty humbling to work with some of the PhD students in my department.
Well, I think what we're going to do when we come back is I want you to help me visualize that if your research actually does reach the level where you want it to be, what's healthcare going to look like for us 5 or 10 years down the road? So I think that's really important for us to see that. So we'll be right back with Daniela Witten.
Four Peaks is made possible by generous support from the Museum of History and Industry and from Weber Shandwick.
We're talking about health, genes, and stats with Daniela Witten. Daniela, we're looking at the future, and we're also looking at our healthcare system. As you're being able to use this big data to figure out how each of us are unique and to actually sort of customize that therapy, what do you think 5 to 10 years down the road, what will healthcare look like for us?
Well, I can't tell you what it will look like, but I can tell you what the goal is. And the goal really is just to be able to predict and diagnose in a more targeted way. So for instance, there might be some particular type of cancer that's really rare in the general population, but wouldn't it be really great if I could figure out, or if someone could figure out, which people are really at risk for that particular disease, so that we can, for instance, do screening more proactively for that subset of people. And another example is, like prostate cancer. Like it's very well understood that a lot of people have prostate cancer, and that it isn't always necessarily the best strategy to go in and treat it. But unfortunately, we don't right now have great ways to know which cases really need to be treated very aggressively and which ones don't. And so the vision is that in 5 or 10 years, we're going to have a better understanding and therefore better ways to treat patients.
I talked to Leroy Hood from the Institute for Systems Biology recently, and he said that based on some of the things you just mentioned, we're moving away from a health care sort of reactive system to a much more proactive wellness system. That
Right.
if we know that this stuff's already in our genes, that we can actually change our behavior along the way.
Yeah.
How much does your work figure into that as well?
Well, I think, this all just, again, is just going to boil down to the idea of big data. And I think that is what Leroy was referring to, where there are just these massive amounts of data. I mean, the data that we have are unlimited. And if only we could sift through it a little bit more effectively, we could figure out, for instance, like, you are really at risk for this one disease, so you should do this special thing that we don't recommend for other people, but for you it really makes a lot of sense. And that's really the goal, and I think that's what he was referring to. And this really, if it does come to fruition, this is going to be affecting sort of all aspects of how we think about health and wellness.
That seems really hopeful to me. Because you've been identified as this innovator, innovation is really about sort of having no boundaries and thinking about the future. If you were free of all obligations and restrictions, what would you do right now?
Oh, I would, I'd be at work in my office.
So you're living the dream is what you're saying.
No, I mean, I truly do love what I do. And that's honestly one of the things that's so wonderful about being a professor is that, I'm paid to do research, and I do the research that I want to do. And if I weren't interested in it, I would be doing something else. So I really just feel lucky almost all of the time.
Well, I think you've truly done a good job of explaining how your passion is actually going to benefit us all. So I wish you the best of luck with your work moving forward. Daniela Witten, healthcare pioneer, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us here at Four Peaks. If you want to find out more, extend your reach at fourpeaks.org. I'm Hanson Hossein.
Production of Four Peaks would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors.